Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for your patience and welcome to this webinar, Self-Regulation, Why It's Important. We're going to go through this again just because some of you had a bit of trouble hearing. So I'm Sara. I'm the Kids Matter Manager for SANT and WA, and joining me today is Natasha. And you'll hear from Natasha later on. She's based in Tasmania. So Kids Matter is funded by the Department of Health and Beyond Blue. Early Childhood Australia is partnering with Beyond Blue and in school context with Headspace to support whole of service and school in implementing the Kids Matter framework and also undertaking the professional learning that goes along with that. So the question we often ask, or we always ask, is your school or early learning service registered and participating with Kids Matter? If you are, that's excellent. You've probably already been to our webinars before and you will already know, but I'll remind you that the webinars can support your progress through the professional learning and your actions towards supporting the mental health of young children that you work with. We've been presenting the whole series of webinars. Some of you have probably attended nearly all of them over the past few months. And we're really excited to let you know that there are more to come, so stay tuned for the dates and topics for those. If your school or early learning service isn't registered to participate in Kids Matter, we really recommend or suggest that you register. So the link already went in the chat, but it might go up in again so that you can sign up. And if you're not sure what that means or what that looks like, or want to ask some questions about that, feel free to ask about that and about what's involved. The other really exciting piece of news is that our whole Kids Matter team will also be at the Early Childhood Australia National Conference, which will be in Sydney the 19th to the 22nd of September in a couple of weeks. So we've got a booth there. So if you're going to be at the conference, come and visit us at the booth and say hi and say you saw us on the webinar. You also might spot some of the Kids Matter team around the event. We're going to have our Kids Matter badges or shirts on. So you might see us standing out in the crowd a bit. So let's move on to our conversation about self-regulation and why it's important for everyone. As we move into this conversation, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians from the lands in which we're all gathering on today and pay my respects to elders past, present and those that are emerging, because they continue to hold the memories, traditions and ways of being for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. We really recognise the importance of continued connection to culture, to country, to community, and its importance to the health and social and emotional wellbeing of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children. So as we begin this conversation about self-regulation and its importance to early childhood mental health and wellbeing, let's try and keep in mind the history and traditions of thousands and thousands of years, and maybe draw on the wisdom of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who use land, connection to place, culture, and ancestors to understand and regulate emotions, thoughts and feelings. Everybody can be informed by ways of knowing, doing and being, and especially drawing on these perspectives has contributed to relationships within your community, communicated respect and also commitment to reconciliation, realising a really strong, healthy future for all Australian children. So, thinking about that, we're here today to consider, learn and reflect on early childhood wellbeing and education. On our screen, to just focus ourselves a little bit more, are the ways that we're going to reflect on today. And significant to this is that looking after yourself is really important. So a sense of safety is a foundational requirement for everybody's mental health, and a sense of security and also for forming relationships. So this means that we are safe to be who we are able to work with our strengths, we are able to express our opinions and our beliefs, and we also feel heard and respected even when people will have different ways of understanding or knowing in the world. So this is, I guess, really important not only for ourselves but also for children, because they learn from what the adults around them do. So being aware of how to look after yourself and support each other can not just make a difference to you, but it also is really important for the children that we work with. or are with as well. So children build a picture of themselves by observing and modelling what adults doing as well. So we'll be asking you to interact and contribute during today's webinar, and I know that you're already talking in the chat, so that will be something that you'll want to continue. But there will also be opportunity for you to take stock and think about your practices. We'll have some polls and some reflective questions. So just to let you know, feel comfortable to contribute what you feel okay with, as I said, in the chat box or in response to some of the polls and those kind of things. But remember, take care of yourself. And if some unexpected feelings emerge, particularly if they're difficult ones, remember to make sure that you talk to someone or have a yarn with someone about that. I think just to give a bit of a picture about what we're going to be talking about today in terms of self-regulation, the webinar is going to explore children's ability to self-regulate and particularly what educators can do to help that. We'll look at the importance of self-regulation for adults as well. So I think that's going to be a really interesting part of the conversation that we have. So we're going to define self-regulation and look at why and how it's important for children's development, for their learning and for their mental health. And we'll discuss why, it's a topical or current focus at the moment and some things we can do to support educators to help children regulate. I guess I really want to acknowledge too that everybody's at a different stage in their professional life. So some of this information might be completely new to you or you haven't heard it presented in this way. For other people, this might be something that you've heard many times before. And so hopefully you will all have an opportunity to, anytime you do some learning, to take something away or to reflect on your own practice by sharing ideas with other people or contributing what you know and what you've learned as well with each other. So bringing all that learning that we all have together. So let's get started, and we're going to do a poll next, and we're going to start thinking about this topic of self-regulation to ask yourself, what is it that you do to regulate your body when at the beginning of the day? Now you can answer more than once. Some people already obviously know how to do this poll thing. Lots of people having coffees first thing. Natasha, are you able to add something? Do you want to add anything? I have to have a shower. My first thing, I have to have a shower.
I am very lucky because I live near the water, so I like to spend a couple of minutes every morning drinking a coffee and just looking across the water and just taking that time to get myself set up for the day. Yeah.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I was thinking about this when I was doing preparation for this. And I forgot to say, if something's on the list that's not there, so Natasha would probably put it in the chat. So put your things in the chat that if they're not here. If I don't have that shower first thing, I'll go straight there. My day is different. It doesn't feel the same. And that sometimes in the morning, I'll, like on the weekends, the energy's a bit different. So I don't, that works okay on the weekends, but certainly not during the week. I need to go and have a shower. So some people are saying that they sometimes will do some prayers perhaps in the morning, or putting your makeup on and just putting your clothes on, some other people have said. I reckon the sky's gone all dark outside, so I apologise for the darkness of my camera. The lights outside's changed, so hopefully you can still see me okay. All right, I reckon that's... we finished the poll, so we'll move on to the next, and I'll hand over to Natasha.
Thanks, Sara, very much. And I think, just thinking about the reflections in the chat, I think, some of the things that we do, as you were saying, Sara, they're quite sort of routine, and often we get sort of cued in when we use really familiar things each and every day, like, getting ready or having, putting particular makeup on that can really help sort of orient us for the day. So now what we'd like to do is really look at what we mean by the term self-regulation. So Stuart Shanker has undertaken considerable work in this area, and he sums up self-regulation with the statement that's on the slide there. And what he says is that self-regulation is the ability to manage your own energy state, emotions, behaviours and attention in ways that are socially acceptable and help to achieve positive goals such as maintaining good relationships, learning and maintaining wellbeing. And this is pertinent to both children and to adults. So we'll be discussing why he differentiates between self-control and self-regulation later in the webinar, but it's worth just noting that in many of the books and the articles about this topic, the terms can be used sort of interchangeably. Most reference to self-regulation talks about a range of characteristics and abilities that help children in terms of how they manage their thinking, their attention, their feelings and their behaviour. A more simplified explanation is in the information for families and early childhood educators, and there'll be a link popping up in your chat. And its reference is really to the idea of one of balance, and that's kind of helpful, I think, perhaps to think about. Self-regulation can also sometimes be referred to with the analogy of an air traffic control system that sort of organises the way in which the brain might help us to regulate our attention, our feelings and behaviour, and which involves inhibition, working memory and cognitive flexibility. And this is sometimes referred to as executive functioning. So some people refer to this as a bit of a stop and think model. So why would we want to focus on self-regulation? Well, in 2012, Stuart Shanker wrote, just about everywhere you turn these days, you come across someone talking about the importance of enhancing children's ability to self-regulate. This is because of a growing number of studies showing that self-regulation lays a foundation for a child's long-term physical, psychological, behavioural and educational wellbeing. In a report in the New York Times in 2014, David Bornstein described a program teaching children to calm themselves because of the increasing prevalence of chronic childhood adversity and its effects on behaviour. He added that one of the biggest lessons for educators and parents who undergo the training to help children is that the very first step is learning how to calm and care for themselves. And we'll talk more about this a bit later. So because of evidence from research, particularly about the brain, we now know much more about how important self-regulation skills are to children's successful learning and development. Because this knowledge has highlighted how critical these skills are, it's led to an urgency among those interested in early childhood to find out more and to link this to practice, particularly in supporting children who are having difficulty in learning these skills. And I think the number of people who have registered for the webinar today is testimony to how much we really value this topic and how much we're all working together to upskill children in this area for their, overall mental health and wellbeing. So the evidence from research today, together with questions being asked by educators and experts around whether many current behaviour management practices are effective, have led many to challenge existing practices and to look for other ways to understand young children's behaviour. There's also much discussion about an increase in the stressors in the environments for young children, which might include things like the effects of screen time and other electronic devices, the busyness of adults, the economic pressures that are placed on families today, situations such as family breakdown and changes to family structures and so forth, and why these would have an effect on the development of self-regulation skills. Many of these stresses are true for adults too, so we really need to remember this as well in the context of the webinar. So let's now move to take a look a little bit more closely at the brain and self-regulation. So one effective way to understand self-regulation is to look a bit at how the brain works. And we've talked about this in our previous webinar on helping young children manage their emotions, but we're going to look at it again now in relation to the development of self-regulation skills. So the key to helping children thrive is to help all the parts of the brain work together. How this takes place is described well in Dan Siegel and Tina Payne-Bryson's book, The Whole Brain Child, and we referred to it in our earlier webinar on managing emotions. So what I want you to do is imagine the brain as having an upstairs and a downstairs. The more basic downstairs part develops earlier, and it controls basic things like breathing, heart rate and sleep. This is also where that flight, fight, freeze response comes from when people feel threatened. And we know that when that's triggered, it's triggered quite automatically and happens sort of immediately for people. The upstairs part of the brain, near the top of our head, develops much later, much into adolescence and early adulthood. And this is where the more complex mental processes take place. Things like decision-making, planning, control over our thinking and our body, self-understanding, empathy, and even morality. So regulating behaviour and emotions requires access to the upstairs part of the brain. But this can be temporarily blocked when someone's experiencing very strong emotions, be them positive or negative. In young children, the upstairs brain is still developing, and so the demanding parts of the brain, the emotional limbic system, can easily take over. So stress can stop us from accessing our upper thinking brain, and for young children, the more stress they encounter, the more that emotional limbic system will take control. So the most important experience for children is the quality of close relationships. Close relationships are full of emotions, and they provide skills and support for the development of emotional regulation. Dan Siegel says that helping all the parts of the brain work together assists the brain to become balanced and integrated. It's constantly trying to link the upstairs and the downstairs, and left to right, and with memory. So one of Dan's ideas is to connect the upstairs and downstairs brain. For example, his Move It or Lose It really confirms the idea that children need regular movement in order to learn and to grow. The prefrontal cortex, which is the part of the thinking brain, supports the process of balance and integration and ultimately self-regulation development. The skills which we teach children will hopefully get the goal-oriented prefrontal cortex to kick in first before the demanding emotional limbic system. So strategies like self-talk and moving the body can help the part of the brain which is activated by fear and anger to calm enough to enable access to the upstairs brain. So if we understand that behaviour is an expression of need in terms of what's happening in the brain, we're more able to help a child develop effective skills to manage that behaviour. In other words, in order to self-regulate. So how does self-regulation develop? Well, self-regulation, we've just had a look at how the brain works in relation to self-regulation. And self-regulation is a process which depends upon learning and maturation. And it's influenced by temperament, and it occurs within the context of relationships. So a child's ability to develop the skills needed for self-regulation are really influenced by age, by temperament, and by their experiences. Learning begins in the womb, and it progresses from an external to internal self-regulation. So what this is about is where, initially children need other people to help regulate them. They move to a place with scaffolding and modelled support where they're learning how to co-regulate to hopefully taking cues in and of themselves to become self-regulated. And so you can see, hopefully from this, that relationships are really central to this process. Individual differences in self-regulation can emerge early in life and are often related to temperamental qualities. So this could be seen, for example, in babies who are perhaps quite difficult to soothe or demonstrate a proneness to fear. So children are going to need different sorts of support. It's important that adults hold developmentally appropriate expectations for children's behaviour and also appreciate the effects of both temperament and experience on behaviour. So Siegel and Bryson suggested that challenging behaviour is often an indication that children can't do something rather than that they won't do something. So believing this can make us look very differently at the behaviour that they're demonstrating. Self-regulated children can delay gratification, immediate gratification, and manage impulses long enough to think ahead to the possible consequence of their actions, or they can consider alternative actions that might be more appropriate. This ability depends on the maturation of the brain and on the children's experience. So that we know, for instance, that children under 3, for example, find it very difficult to delay gratification and are often completely overwhelmed by their experiences and their emotions. So whatever actions we take to assist children should be focused on trying to understand what is causing their behaviour and how this is linked to their stage of development. And I just wanted to quickly have a look. There have been some wonderful comments in chat, and some people suggesting some other ways that they've managed to self-regulate. I love the comment about cuddling the cat, and also delaying getting up as a way of just, staying, giving that extra space and time for getting ready for the day ahead. Now what I'd like to do is perhaps pass back to Sara for a little bit more information on self-regulation and how it might relate to mental health and the importance, as we've stressed, about relationships and the adult's role.
Sorry, Sara, you're just muted at the moment.
Don't forget to unmute, which is the thing I forgot to do. Sorry about that, everybody. I was talking away to you. So Natasha's given us an excellent overview of self-regulation, and hopefully what's starting to happen for people now too, while you're typing away in the chat, that you're also stopping to think and take those moments to process and think perhaps a little bit differently about how you understand self-regulation. And what we are going to move into is our role in thinking about it. And one of the most critical things we can do is understand more about self-regulation, because the more we know, then the more we're able to find more alternatives to respond. So, but let's just have this conversation now about how self-regulation and mental health fit together. I know one of the things that happened for me when I started this role in Kids Matter was, because I'd worked in early childhood for a long time, is that I knew about social and emotional wellbeing and social skills and emotional skills, but I didn't know them as mental health. And so thinking about self-regulation and mental health together is something actually probably that most people who work in early childhood will actually know, but they won't know it as mental health. So to start with, I'll just share with you, and this is coming for you, the definition's coming in the chat as well, but the way we define early childhood mental health is the capacity of a young child. And that's really important given what we've just heard from Natasha around children's temperament and their maturation and those kind of things. So this is about what the child can manage and what they can do right now. And again, in the context of their family and their environment and their culture. So the capacity of the young child to participate in the physical and the social environment, the capacity of the young child to form healthy and secure relationships, the capacity of the young child to experience, to regulate, to understand and express their emotions, and being able to do all of those things with their emotions, the capacity of the young child to understand their behaviour and to regulate it. You can't understand it. If you can't understand it, it's really hard to regulate. Also, the capacity of the child has to interact appropriately, whatever that means, with others, and also developing that sense of that really strong and secure sense of who they are. And I know all of those things are really critical and relevant in the early childhood context, but that's how we define early childhood mental health. And if we think about what being mentally healthy looks like, because when we talk about mental health, we're not just referring to mental health difficulties, we're actually talking about the continuum of mental health, where we can be mentally healthy and then we can go along the continuum to have mental health difficulties. When we ask educators to talk about what a mentally healthy 2-year-old might look like, or what a mentally healthy 4-year-old might look like, they often will describe self-regulating behaviours and emotions and thoughts, where the child's able to fully express how they're feeling. They're able to calm themselves with some help, so co-regulate when they're feeling distressed. They don't stay in that distressed state for a long period of time. They also can play really easily with other children. When a child doesn't have that capacity, they might have some difficulties in emotional and behavioural self-regulation. And if this occurs across different settings, so not just at early childhood and not just at the setting and not just at home and not just when they're out in a busy, maybe at the shopping centre or wherever, and also if it occurs over long periods of time, these can be warning signs that mental health difficulties might be present. And some of the signs of self-regulation issues in children might include things like ongoing difficulties with concentration, the child appearing or looking really sad all of the time, or much of the time, or being disinterested in activities and not just distracted, but just not interested in things, or when children become really easily upset, or when they're really worried, and so to the point where they're actually not able to engage in anything or to move on to the next thing or participate in whatever's going on. So it's really important that we can identify these two things, and Natasha will talk about a little bit more how we might be able to, what an observation tool we might be able to use to help us with that later on. But better self-regulation skills in early childhood, the better the skills the child has, the better social skills and more positive mental health that they will have in later life. I'm just going to go, I'm just checking the some of the chat. Yeah, so people are saying things like lots of abilities are needed, and something that, things greatly affect children's, will impact a lot on children's mental health and wellbeing and on their capacity to self-regulate. So if we think about, Natasha's already touched on this as well, there's more and more evidence emerging about the critical role of relationships and how relationships impact on the development of personality, on self-esteem, on physical health and learning, and on self-regulation. So someone like Jack Shonkoff, who's the director of the Harvard Center on the Developing Child, said there is no development without relationships, which is really powerful for everyone who's involved with young children. And I think one of the things that's really important to me, and I thought about it for a really long time, is that in early childhood we know relationships are important. We would say things like relationships are fundamental to the work we do, our work is built on relationships, all of those kind of things. But I wonder how much we actually really reflect on our relationships and how intentional we are with relationships, thinking about what that means for all children. So, and I guess for early childhood people, at the heart of the work we do is quality, and the quality of relationships, how positive those relationships are, is actually really vital. So this is a point, I guess, or a moment where we could stop and reflect and think about how, and you might want to comment about these things in the chat. So how do we build positive relationships with children? How do we develop strong connections, and are connections different to relationships? How do we respect these relationships and make them a priority in our work? I think there's some other questions about how do we know that the way we do relationships works for children, for all children? How are we intentional about our relationships? And I can see some people are putting some comments in the chat about those kind of things. So just to finish off that previous slide, we were the circle of security uses the frame bigger, stronger, wiser and kind, and that's one way of describing what it might look like. So reflecting on those kind of things is really important as well. One of the things that I guess about relationships is that children learn about relationships by being in them, and they also learn about relationships by watching and seeing other people in relationships as well. So it's both those ways that children will learn about relationships with significant people in their lives. And that's people like their parents, but also educators are really important in that way as well. So again, some more questions to think about. Who do educators need to be in order to develop children's self-regulation, and how do they do this? And I guess this is that notion of being intentional. So who and how are both the elements that are really important, or what and how are both really important. Part of this, so Anita's saying in the comments, it's really important to get down to the child's level, open-ended questions. She's saying lots of love and cuddles, and that's a really interesting point, because I think, touch and being close to people to children is critical, and some people feel like that's there's some questions around the appropriateness of that. I'm not asking those questions, but some people feel uncomfortable in the professional world, and it's about building on a sense of trust as well. So one of the things that we do need to think about is about our own self-regulation, because getting back to that notion of self-regulation being an important part of building those positive relationships. And again, like I said at the beginning, adult self-regulation is critical for our own well-being, but also to support children's self-regulation. So again, some more questions. What is it that pushes your buttons? What aspects of the child's behaviour might you be reacting to? And then how do you keep yourself calm and manage your own emotions? Does it work? Are you able to manage your feelings and emotions, or are there some other things that you might need to try? So again, to be able to regulate, you need to be able to understand and recognise your emotions, and then to calm them down. I think it's Dan Siegel that says you've got to name it to tame it. So you need to be able to describe what the feeling is to be able to calm it down. And so for adults, we need to be able to do that too. So it might be just taking a breath and thinking and stopping for a while. And Natasha's already talked about that strategy as well, to think about what's going on for you. And also then you can start thinking about what's going on for the child, and then you can respond in a calm way. So some people are starting to describe the things that are, now Natasha's already talked about stressors. So what are the things that that actually might be triggers for you? How do you know when you're feeling overwhelmed or stressed? Because it's important to identify those things so you can help manage your own feelings. I remember when I was working with children, it used to be I'd go on my lunch break and everything was all organised and everything was lovely in the room and everything was all ready, and then I come back from lunch and the whole world was turned upside down, and it would just really be something that would make me feel really. So I would come back from lunch thinking, oh, is that going to happen? So I started a strategy of doing a check at the door before I went in. So just to go, it is what it is and it'll be fine, and taking a breath before I stepped into the room, so then I could enter the room in a really different way with different thinking in my head. Anyway, another strategy too, and particularly helpful for children, is to talk out loud to describe your own self-regulation. So, saying, I'm feeling frustrated, I'm just going to take a deep breath and count to 5 before I move on. I think we have to be really genuine in that, though. We can't be, often we hear people and I say, oh, I refer to it as their childcare voice. I'm really cross with you, but actually I'm not, my tone is saying something different. So it has to be genuine. Some of you may have attended a previous webinar about children's behaviour and interactions, and that talks a lot about how our reactions to children can impact on their behaviour. And if you haven't watched it, the link's coming in the chat as well. And again, similar to Natasha mentioned this earlier, but there's a Stop, Reflect, Act tool that's also coming as a link in the chat, which gives you a process for stopping and being able to connect with your thoughts before you act, which is also really helpful. The other thing I think that's really critical, and again, Natasha spoke about this as well, is that we many times, and this is a really important role that we play, we overestimate the child's ability to manage their emotions and behaviour. We have expectations far beyond what a child can actually manage or what their capacity is. So it's really important that we understand not just what's going on developmentally generally, but also what's happening for individual children. So maybe you might want to make a mind map of what actually they can regulate, given some of the things that we might have talked about today. And then you might be able to think of some new things that you could do to support their self-regulation and your own in that process as well. So we thought that you might like to hear some things that children say about how they feel. And also, and some of you may have seen this clip before, it's been on social media and on YouTube before. So we're not going to show you the video, but the link will come to you in the chat. But here are some comments that children have made from the video. And I'm going to read some, and then Natasha's going to read some as well. So this is how I might feel if I'm unregulated. My blood keeps pumping because I'm really mad, and when I'm mad, my brain can get a headache and it can start hurting, and you can get sweaty because you're really, really mad. And then when you get really mad, you turn red.
Sara, I've got one here which I love, which says, it's kind of like if you had a jar and the jar would be your brain, and then you put glitter in the jar and that would be how you were feeling. If you shook the jar and the glitter went everywhere, that would be how your mind looks. And then it's just spinning around and you don't have any time to think. And here's just a couple of comments about what children said about how they calm down.
Calming down is like not moving. It's like slowing down, and then it stops, and the heart pumps slow, and then it goes into your brain.
My brain slows down, and then I feel more calm, and then I'm ready to speak to that person.
So one of the things that really strikes me every time I watch that, and even just hearing those children's words again, is that when children are intentionally taught how to understand what's going on for them in their bodies, and in their emotions and their thinking, they are able to really clearly articulate. I think these children in this video are about 6 and 7. They're really clearly able to articulate and talk about and describe what's going on when they feel unregulated. And then they also know and are able to talk about what strategies they can use and they have used that have been successful. And I think that's really powerful. But what that means is, what that tells me is that children can manage that when they're intentionally taught those things. And I think that's really powerful. One of the things that is really important for us to learn about is the difference between self-regulation and self-control. And Natasha touched on this earlier too. The first thing we need to understand is about what a stressor is, because this impacts on how we understand it. So a stressor is an occurrence that triggers a response from the body in 5 domains. So either biologically, emotionally, cognitively, socially, or in a pro-social way. So it could be a sensitivity to loud noises or particular touches, or a lowered ability to maintain attention for long periods of time. There's a whole range of things that can be considered stressors. And all of us will have different stressors, and some of them will be quite impactful and others will be more minor and we're able to manage them more. So sometimes if you're running late, that can be something that really is triggering for people, or not having that coffee in the morning, or being really tired. And I think a lot of you talked about these things before. Or some people, for some people, just being in a large group of people actually can be a stressor. Now, the important thing about this is what you can see on the slide there, is that self-regulation is the ability to respond and recover from individual stressors. So that's what those children were talking about, bringing the body and mind back to a calm and alert state. Self-control, which is often what we want and expect from children, is actually a learned behaviour, which involves not only being able to manage your responses to events and to people, but actually using some skills and some cues and language to solve problems in a methodical way. So the better a child can self-regulate or deal with stresses, the more energy they have left to be able to develop the self-control skills. And I think often we jump straight to wanting children to have self-control skills before we've actually supported them to develop the self-regulation skills. And so in that way, if we learn more about what self-regulation looks like and how we might support it for a child, and also what it looks like for children, then we might be actually meeting their needs where they're up to, and being able to actually help them develop those skills of self-regulation and then self-control as well. So we're getting lots of different definitions of self-regulation and lots of elements that kind of make up the picture to help us understand more about it. And as I've already said, this is a really critical thing to us helping children. The more informed we are, the more helpful, the more we learn, the more we're able to find some different opportunities to help children. So again, we're sharing the work from Dr. Stuart Shanker, and you'll see the link about his book in the chat. And he talks particularly about these 4 aspects of self-regulation. And so if we think about that in terms of children, you'll be able to have a look at those and think about what that might look like for children. And I was thinking about the energy one. You go on an excursion and you come back, and all you want to do, and some of the children want to do, is sit down and have a quiet time, or maybe have a talk about what's happened. And there's a child who actually can't sit still, and they just need to keep going because their energy level is still at the height from the excitement of going on the excursion. And so being able to modify that and match the energy to the new task or the new situation of perhaps sitting and having a nice quiet talk and reflection is really difficult for that child. And they may actually need some support and some help to learn how to do that. And so some of these other ones you'll think about, I'm sure you'll think about too, about thinking about what might happen for a child in each of these when they need to monitor, evaluate and modify emotions, or shift attention necessarily. And some children, that's a really difficult thing to do. for some children to actually focus on the task is a difficult thing. For other children, once they're focused, it's really hard for them to change their focus and to participate in something else. Recognising and understanding that range of social interactions is really critical as well. And again, goes back to the definition of mental health. Children need to be able to understand those things, but they need to be supported to learn how to participate in a group and be a friend and be a participant in different social settings with different roles. And you need to learn any skill, and I think often we forget this with children, is you actually need to practice. So if we were teaching a child to learn to ride a bike, we would be practicing and we would expect mistakes. But sometimes with these kind of skills, we don't have that same view. So we expect the child to be able to do it really perfectly straight away. We don't give them the opportunity to practice in small chunks with lots of encouragement and those kind of things. So I think, breaking these down and recognising all of the small aspects is really helpful. And what we're going to do is explore this a little bit further. Natasha's going to look at our case study, Chris, to think about and explore what his behaviour might be telling us.
Thanks, Sara, very much. And so hopefully you guys have had a bit of a chance to read Chris's story and perhaps to think a little bit about this person, and perhaps to have considered a bit about what we can actually see from Chris's behaviour. So if we look at the description of Chris's behaviour that's in the case study, it's great and really important to think about the language that's been used in that case study write-up. So we found out that Chris is boisterous, that Chris bites when he doesn't get his own way, that he finds it difficult to sit quietly, Chris shouts out when he wants something, and Chris bosses other people around. The only sort of positively worded descriptor in the case study is that Chris is very good at ball games. So the language used to describe his behaviour really needs to move from what the behaviour is telling us, and move away from the negative attitude towards his behaviour. Things like he likes to get up to mischief and he just won't sit still, which have a bit of a judgment around, a negative judgment around what he's doing, and it implies that the behaviour is really intentional. On the right of the slide, we have the previous slide's list of what self-regulation involves. So let's just have a quick look at it in relation to Chris's behaviour. And what I'd like you to do is I'm going to invite you to pop any comments into the chat around what you might see or what you might take away from this slide. So have a look at where those arrows point, and they're coming from all different directions and pointing to all different experiences of Chris. And to me, the slide it's quite messy and it's quite complicated. And I think this really helps to represent the struggles that Chris is facing and how he might be feeling. To me, it looks overwhelmed and it looks chaotic and confusing. And I guess the most important question in amongst this really is, how can Chris be learning when there are so many areas that he first needs help with, and that are all being affected by the different behaviours? So have a think. Where would you first focus on helping Chris? What would be your first area that you might work on? And you're very welcome to tell us in the chat. I'm just giving you a minute just to pop any thoughts that you have about Chris's case study and that previous slide that we've got up there. Fantastic, and there's great comments coming through, reminders that we don't feel one emotion at a time, but many, and that it's really difficult for children to verbalise how they're feeling, and that something in the environment may not be working for him. And someone's already thought of a great place to start around connecting with him using his strengths through ball games, and and other people have commented on opportunities to use his body, and I think that's spot on. So part of our job as adults in terms of helping children to learn those regulation skills is just as Sara said, it's around naming what they're feeling and providing that sort of running commentary so they themselves get tuned into, when I'm feeling this way, I might be thinking and I might be feeling this, but also in using their strengths to think about where to where to next. So if we look at the self-regulation cycle now, and we think about where stressors might be occurring for children, stressors can be a range of things. You know, they might be a really loud noise. It might be having to maintain attention for a long period of time. Some children might find stressors as social interactions. Some stressors can make us feel very hyper alert, and other stressors can make us feel hypo alert. But it really does depend a bit on the individual. So, for instance, let's take the example of lack of sleep. It can make us feel drowsy and a bit hypo alert and less attentive. But for some children, a lack of sleep can make them hyper alert, and it's almost like they're trying to stay awake so they don't miss anything, and they sort of, you know, they get almost sort of overactive and the like. So it's good to recognise that there's a time and a place for the range of levels of alertness, and I think Sara was alluding to this before too. So we need to be drowsy when it's bedtime, but we need to be hyper alert when it's time to, say, you know, take part in a running race. But we also need to be able to manage these states of arousal to suit the activity that we're participating in. Okay, so let's quickly have a look at Chris's self-regulation cycle. So he's not sure how to regulate his body, and he's responding to the stresses with quite negative behaviour. And then he really struggles to return to a calm and alert state. So this is definitely going to be impacting on his self-confidence and, of course, on his mental health. Chris's security in his relationships with others is also being affected. So we've heard that his parents are often yelling at him to behave, that he's shouting and bossing other children around. And so his interactions and his relationships with people around him are becoming quite negative. So very quickly, these might be some of the things that we could consider as Chris's stresses. First off, you know, having the capacity to match his energy level to the activity that he's undertaking. So it seems as though Chris might be having difficulty understanding that there are different energy levels needed for different experiences and activities, and he's struggling to change those throughout the day. Chris may also be having difficulty dealing with strong emotions. So, for instance, if he doesn't get his way, he might bite others to, you know, to influence that and to get his own way. And this might also recognise to his capacity to recognise feelings in other people, and perhaps say in understanding that other children might want their way too. Chris is finding it really difficult to ignore distractions, and we can see that from his behaviour of getting up and down at lunchtime and looking in other people's lunch boxes. So he's finding it difficult to ignore the distractions that are around him. Chris might also be finding it quite difficult to be part of a two-way interaction. So he shouts, and he might need to learn more appropriate communication, so not shouting at people when he wants something. And lastly, and we spoke a little bit about this before, helping Chris to recognise other people's emotions might help him to understand how they feel when he exhibits some of those more challenging behaviours like biting or bossing people around. So for educators, moving away from a negative view of a child's behaviour into a view of what is this behaviour telling us can have a positive effect on our own mental health. So, you know, constantly focusing on the negatives and viewing things negatively can really bring us down. But when we stop and we look for positive solutions, it gives us something to aim for and to hope for, and it helps us also to better understand the child and their needs. So we can help by observing children, and we can help and using these observations to help to identify stressors. So we can look for what it is that's causing a change in a child's state of arousal and the consequent behaviours that are being displayed. We can help by observing children and reducing these stresses where possible. So there's lots of great programs that can be used to get children to really burn their energy off, to burn some of their excess energy. And I think particularly in the area of regulation, some of the sensory techniques and tools that we've got available are really effective. And they sensory regulation activities like rhythmic jumping or bouncing, squeezing putty, having deep pressure cuddles, curling up in a corner, they activate the lower parts of the brain. So they're easy to do and they're simple to do, and they can be really effective in calming and then allowing us to access that upstairs area of the brain too. supporting children to regulate their body with lots of supportive language and with exposure to learning experiences. So naming things, explaining what you think the child might be feeling and the observations that you've made of the child to help that. I notice you're looking really cross. Is that because X, Y, and Z? And we can also teach and encourage self-regulation techniques, things like deep breathing. And I really love where you get children to breathe in as they trace their thumb and out as they go back to their hand and in as they go across their fingers and out, which can slow the breathing. Things like meditation techniques, visualization scripts, improving sleep patterns and those sorts of things. So these steps are going to help children in becoming calm and ready for learning. And so educators are really supporting the development of self-regulation skills through appropriate modelling, through guidance and through communication, as well as providing a highly supportive environment. So given that self-regulation is so integral to mental health and wellbeing, we really need to consider inclusive practices based on positive relationships. So with specific regards to Chris, we could perhaps be asking ourselves questions like, does Chris have a sense of belonging and connectedness here? What are his relationships like with other children and with educators? Are all the interactions with Chris really focused on his behaviour, or are there opportunities for positive interactions with him and those sorts of conversations? I think as you put into the chat, you know, that real importance of recognising how important relationships are is essential. So thinking in Chris's case about what sort of relationships educators might have with Chris's parents. We've got reports on what's happening at home, but we're not sure from this case study what the relationship is like between Chris's parents and the educators. You know, do they feel connected with the service? Are they working together with educators in partnership? There's a number of indicators that would suggest that Chris might benefit from specific social and emotional skill development. So he might not have had the opportunity to learn these skills before he's come to the service. And if we reframe some of Chris's behaviour, such as his difficulty playing in a group or developing friendships, then we can think differently about his behaviour and we can focus on teaching him those skills, just as we would other skills. The skill development doesn't have to be in addition to his curriculum, but making the most of what is already going on. So just as the beautiful comments in chat went, concentrating on his strengths and also supporting Chris to recognise what it feels like to be calm. Maria, can you click to the next slide for me, please? Thank you very much. So let's look at how we could assist Chris. We can observe him carefully and tune in and identify his needs. And there is an observational tool that we can use. And Maria, I'm not sure if you could pop that into the chat for me. And that helps us to look at children's behaviour, as well as to think about the emotions that might be behind the behaviour and the thinking behind the behaviour as well as looking at the impact that this might be having on learning and also on social relationships. Now, this tool, if Maria is able to pop it into the chat for us, is not a diagnostic tool, but it can provide us with some valuable insights into what's happening for a child's behaviour, as well as the next steps that we might like to take, whether that's a conversation with a colleague or whether or with a more experienced educator, whether it's conversations with family, or whether it's a referral to an external support person. So the other ways that we could assist Chris would be to do things like use words or gestures and touch as cues to help co-regulate his feelings and behaviour, to use our proximity to him and his gentle touch to provide timely support, to name and to acknowledge feelings, but still setting limits and identifying opportunities, and to help him notice and understand the sensations or images and feelings and thoughts that are happening within himself. Providing Chris with lots of engaging opportunities for practice. So just as Sara said, you know, these skills won't come automatically. They need rehearsal and repetition and practice to bring them into children's regular repertoires. So building on his strengths, you know, using ball games and other movement activities and making sure that our steps and our expectations around those activities are also clear. So engaging him, increasing the fun factor and talking about what occurred and how he felt. it would be really important for us to be really warm and responsive and to make a really strong connection with Chris and to redirect him when it's appropriate and to provide really regular encouragement as well as specific feedback when it's needed. Last of all, it would be really important for us to demonstrate and to model our own self-regulation. And so we know that it takes a calm brain to calm a brain, and it's really important that we model our own self-regulation through our behaviour with children and families and with other educators. So, as I mentioned before, it might be useful to use a descriptive commentary to name for him what might be happening for him, as well as what other people might be thinking or feeling. To teach mindfulness skills like deep breathing, to teach waiting skills, and to demonstrate the skill of self-talk. So I think that just about sums up Chris, and hopefully all of those things are going to really support him to develop that. And now we're going to go back to Sara just to hear the final bit.
Thanks so much, Natasha. I think exploring that and hearing and seeing everybody's comments about all of the things that they're already doing has been an amazing way to share practice and also to recognise that people are doing lots of great work in this area. I guess what you can see on the screen are some things that we could think about for all children, and we won't have time to go through them. But again, remember, this is about you learning about and understanding more about self-regulation so you can support children. And one of the things I was thinking about in this session was that children just start to develop these skills at around age 3, but they're not fully developed till age 8, a bit like reading. And so we need to have that appropriate expectation. Anne-Marie's saying it takes a calm brain to calm a brain, and I think that's absolutely right. So hopefully you've had an opportunity to explore a whole lot of ideas and thoughts and suggestions and real examples from us and also from each other. But we need to finish up now. And so, have we got time to do the poll? No, probably not, because I think we've already done a whole lot of sharing of your ideas and those kind of things anyway. So we'll just finish up with letting you know about thinking about that these webinars are a great way to learn and reflect, and also to put learning into action. And I think there's been lots of opportunities for that. The other thing that I also noticed that people are demonstrating their individual commitment to ongoing professional development, and that is a critical aspect in any of our work with really young children. Remember that you can think about this in terms of your Kids Matter journey as well, and that this is part of your professional learning in terms of what's happening for your Kids Matter professional learning. So contact our team today and we can help you document this learning that you've done during this webinar or that you will continue to do after the webinar. If you're participating, if you're already a participating early childhood service or school, you just need to contact your consultant or attend a national check-in. If you're not registered, remember that you can complete the short online form and get started. And if you want to know more, then please feel free to ask us. Again, thank you very much for attending. We're really looking forward to seeing you online soon. And as I said before, stay tuned for some more webinars to come. We really look forward to, if you're going to be at the Early Childhood Australia National Conference in Sydney, 19th to the 22nd of September, come and visit us or find us wandering around with our shirts or badges on. Remember that Stuart Shanker will be, we've referred to him a couple of times, he will be at the conference as well. He'll be a keynote, which will be fabulous to hear what he's got to say, and he's very inspiring to listen to as well. The last thing I need to remind you to do is to complete the exit survey that's going to be put up soon. This is particularly important if you want to get a certificate, and if everybody who's attending with you wants a certificate, you will also need to include their names and email addresses. So if you just put one, that's not enough. You need to put the names and the email addresses of everybody who's watching with you so that you can get a certificate too. So I think that's just about coming to the end. Remember the exit survey. Thank you so much, Natasha, for your excellent contribution and great adding to the conversation. And also really, really thank everybody for their really great contributions in the chat too. Was really great too. We didn't get a chance to respond to many, and we did see some of them. But yeah, I know that there was a lot of chat going on, a lot of really good examples.
Yeah, thank you so much, everyone, and for participating so readily and so generously, as you say, Sara, in the chat. So, and thank you, Sara, for excellent information.
So remember to include the email addresses in that exit survey. We really look forward to seeing you as part of Kids Matter soon. Thanks, everybody.